ruthless dictator. He could have called up the jail at any point in time and said, let this guy go, not worth the trouble. I don't want to deal with this. He obviously did not. When do you, if you had to speculate, two questions. When do you think Assad became aware that an American was being held by his people? Because he obviously had to know eventually. And two, what do you think the Assad regime's reason for keeping you was? What were they looking for?
Yeah, I don't know the answers to those questions, but I do think that when General Ibrahim intervened from Lebanon, I think that's when the Syrians started to realize that I was who I was saying I was. I was not a threat to their national security. I was not a spy. I was truly just someone exploring and better understanding the world. That's what I was truly doing. And I think they started to figure that out once the Lebanese began to intervene. And I think that Assad knew about this in the first few weeks. I think at some point in those first couple weeks, the information got to him and he said, well, let me think about what to do with him. I think they were trying to figure out who I actually was but I think he did know, and he also I have pretty good information that suggests that he did personally sign off on releasing me.
Well, that is fascinating that you'll be able to say forever that one of the most famous, infamous dictators in the world signed for yours. And now let's talk about that. So walk me through. You don't have any idea what's going on with the general in Lebanon. You don't have any idea what's going on stateside. The moment you get released, I cannot wait to hear about this. Walk me through step by step how you end up getting out.
Yep. So on July 26th, one of the inmates came to the cell I was in. He called my name and he indicated that I was being moved. And as he escorted me outside, kind of going back to my last point here, he said, Sam, you're very lucky. He said, President Assad has agreed to release you. Now, this sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months by the officials, by the judge, that I had essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But outside, I stepped into a black SUV, which turned out to be part of this 5-vehicle convoy that raced out of Damascus at what seemed to be 100 miles an hour. I mean, we didn't stop at traffic lights. We used the shoulder of the road to maneuver around traffic. We drove west towards the mountains, and nobody in the vehicle said a word. The nice cars, the professional nature of the operation was making me think that this was all really good or really bad. I'm about to experience one extreme of the captivity spectrum here, but I don't know
Let me
which
ask
one
you,
it is.
when you see these guys in the car, are they wearing like suits and ties? Are they in military gear?
They were in military gear, and I learned later that they were Lebanese special forces, but I
So did
wasn't sure about that at the time.
so did they have guns on them in the vehicle?
Uh, in the other vehicles, they did. The guy in my vehicle, he was in military uniform. He was not carrying a gun, but the others in the vehicles behind us and in front of us, they were.
And is the reason for the convoy just to make sure that a terrorist group or whatever doesn't hit the convoy on its way back to Lebanon?
I think that's right. And my understanding is that this was an operation or a mission, so to speak. It was all peaceful, thankfully, but they had their agenda for that day was to come into Damascus, get me, and escort me to Beirut. And if something were to get hairy or to go sideways, they were prepared for that. That's what it seemed like to me.
That I am so incredibly fascinated by every step of this. So you're racing in these vehicles, you're riding the road of the shoulder. It is literally like a scene out of a movie. I can hear like the dramatic music in the background. When you cross the border, now you're into Lebanon. What happens once you cross that threshold?
So we came up to this checkpoint and it seemed to be some kind of significant border. And as we passed through, the officer in the vehicle sitting next to me, he subtly tapped me on the leg, and he said, Sam, you're in Lebanon. You're safe now. Uh, This was this was also very encouraging, but I had been lied to again. I've been lied to so many times. I was still trying to figure out what was going on, and we drove from there for about another hour into Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon, and I was taken to the office of Lebanese internal security, kind of like, as I mentioned, the equivalent of an intelligence agency here in the U.S. And when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military intelligence officials and journalists, my parents were there, culminating this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and frankly, this breathtaking display of God answering prayers.
And at this point, are there any American diplomats in Lebanon with you? You say government officials. Are these Lebanese government officials, or are Americans there as well?
The FBI attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, his name was Anish Shukla. He was there, and he was actually the first person who welcomed me there. I'll never forget. He said, Sam, there are so many people back in Washington who are very happy that you're safe. And I remember thinking, how does anybody in Washington even know who I am? I don't even know how that's possible. And then I started to put the pieces together from there. But I had never even talked to a real FBI person before in my life. And so it was overwhelming to start to put those pieces together.
How quickly after this meeting in Beirut happens are you out of the country and back in the United States?
We had the my parents had just arrived that morning, and so we had the option to leave immediately. We ended up just staying for one evening in Beirut and then leaving the next day and flying back.
Do you remember the first thing, your first real meal that you had after getting out of Syrian prison?
So I had some Lebanese food that night with my parents, and then came home the next day, and my first meal was a Chipotle burrito because I was missing that. But actually, um, on that note, a couple days later, about 3 days later, I ended up in the emergency room. I was back in St. Louis. I went to the ER because of stomach pain, and when I came home, I went a little bit crazy with the food, like double cheeseburgers and Chipotle and all these things, ice cream. And it turns out that in those 2 months, my stomach had essentially adapted to this very simple, basic, low calorie diet and was kind of struggling to process a normal Western diet. And I went to the hospital, and thankfully it was pretty simple to sort out. But it does make me wonder about the reintegration process for others who are held for sometimes much longer, sometimes years, and what that process would look like for them. Because even for me, after 9 weeks, I was experiencing that.
Did you have to explain to the doctors that you'd been held in prison in Syria for 2 months? And did they
You know
believe
what?
you?
I don't get to tell this story very much. So I'm glad you asked, because I went to the doctor, and the nurse, I was with my mom, and the nurse was doing her kind of like before the doctor comes in, she was doing her checklist. She was asking questions, and she was trying to figure out like how this could have happened. And I said, yeah, I just came home. I was taken hostage in Syria. And I will never forget, she was poker faced, just stone faced, and wrote this down and just made a note of it. And then she left, and I looked at my mom, and I was like, wow, there was no reaction at all, which, and then I looked at it, we saw it in the notes, and it was just interesting that there was like no reaction. So,
I definitely would have had a reaction. When you get back to the US, did anyone from the US government try to debrief you or question you on anything that had happened when you were in control